This right here is Todd Bertuzzi, a tough physical power forward and a key part of Vancouver's dominant West Coast Express line alongside Markus Naslund and Morrison. He plays hard, he puts up points, and he's always standing up for his teammates. Most see him as gritty, but not dirty, just on the edge. But after a heated rivalry with Steve Moore boils over, what happens next doesn't just change the game, it shatters careers, sparks a criminal investigation, and leaves a scar on hockey that still has not been healed. It was March 8th, 2004, a showdown between the top two teams in the Northwest Division, the Colorado Avalanche and the Vancouver Canucks, inside Rogers Arena, known back then as the General Motors Place. The Avs were a stacked, veteran-led team with future Hall of Famers like Joe Sakic, Peter Forsberg, and Rob Blake, a group that had already tasted Stanley Cup glory. And the Canucks, they were trying to get into that upper echelon of teams in the league. They were led by Markus Naslund, Morrison, two young Swedish twins, and their tough guy, Todd Bertuzzi. But this game, on March 8th, wasn't just going to be any other game, because the last two times these teams met, it got pretty violent. If you want to really understand what happened on March 8th, you have to rewind about 2 weeks, to the fourth of 6 meetings between these two teams during the season. At that point, the season series was dead even, 1 win, 1 loss, and 1 tie apiece. Tensions were already simmering, and what happened next would pour gasoline on the fire. In a close, hard-hitting game between the Canucks and Avalanche, things got ugly. Steve Moore, the Avalanche's young, bottom-six checking forward, threw a cheap shot at Markus Naslund, one of the best players in the entire NHL. He caught him right in the head while he was reaching for the puck, and Naslund was in a pretty bad spot, totally exposed, and if you watch the replay, you could actually see Moore had no intention to go after that puck. To make it worse, Naslund wasn't just any player, he was the leading scorer in the entire NHL at the time. The refs, they didn't call anything. They thought it was just two guys going after a loose puck, but that's just not how it looked on the replays. Vancouver ended up winning that game 1-0, but no one really cared about the score. All anyone was talking about was that hit. Canucks coach Mark Crawford was fuming after the game, and GM Brian Burke ripped into Moore for taking out one of the league's biggest stars. And then somehow, the league didn't suspend him, not even a fine. That's when things started to heat up. Brad May straight up said that there was a bounty on Moore, which would make the rematch a highly anticipated game, and it happened just a week and a half after. With NHL execs watching from the stands, making sure everything went well, this game had all the intensity that you would expect, but surprisingly, it didn't get out of hand. It was definitely a physical game though, there was plenty of penalties and a solid fight between Brookbank and Worrell, but nothing that got too out of hand. Sakic dropped a hat trick, Tanguay put up 5 points, but the Avs couldn't hold the lead and it ended in a 5-5 tie. As for Steve Moore, he was stuck on the fourth line, played just over 7 minutes and didn't really make much of an impact. So the game finished and it was pretty calm, so people thought there was no bad blood left. But just 5 days later, the rematch was on again, and this time, the Canucks weren't just waiting around. Right from the jump, they were clearly going after Steve Moore. And just 6 minutes in, Matt Cook dropped the gloves with him in one of 4 fights in the first period, and by the end of the first, the score was already 5-0 Colorado. It was clear that the Canucks were focusing on something else, and this game was pretty much already over after 20 minutes, and things were getting tense enough that the NHL execs actually had to call the refs during intermission to make sure things didn't spiral out of control. Well, midway through the third period, with the Avs up 8-2, Todd Bertuzzi starts tailing Moore around the ice, trying to provoke him into a fight. And when Moore obviously wants no part of it, Bertuzzi takes things into his own hands, grabs him from behind, punches him in the back of the head, and Moore drops instantly, completely unconscious before he even hits the ice.
A little chat with him, grabs his sweater, gives him a whack, and piling on is Andrei Nicolishin, and everybody's into it. Now we get a line brawl, and Hedberg wants Abisher.
And when he does hit the ice, Bertuzzi falls on top of him, followed by a dog pile of players from both teams. It turned into a full-on line brawl with everyone on the ice involved. And at first, the Canucks crowd was cheering. This was the revenge that they'd been waiting for. But the mood shifted pretty fast. Once it became clear Moore was seriously hurt, the whole arena went silent. Moore was on the ice for about 10 minutes before being stretchered off and taken to the hospital. The game played out, finishing in a 9-2 blowout win for Colorado, but no one really cared. They all cared about if Steve Moore was okay. Shortly after, he was diagnosed with 3 fractured vertebrae, a severe concussion, ligament damage, nerve stretching, facial cuts. The list goes on. The hit didn't just end his season, it ended his entire career, one of which that had just started. 2 days after the incident, Bertuzzi held a press conference, and it was emotional. He broke down in tears as he apologized to Steve Moore and his family, as well to his GM Brian Burke, team owner John McCaw Jr., and the Canucks organization, his teammates, and the fans. He looked crushed. At one point, he even addressed the younger generation watching.
For the kids that watch this game, I'm truly sorry. I don't play the game that way. I'm not a mean-spirited person. And I'm sorry for what happened.
What happened on the ice didn't just lead to a suspension, it led to something way bigger. 2 days after the hit, British Columbia's criminal justice branch officially charged Bertuzzi with assault causing bodily harm. By December of 2004, Bertuzzi pled guilty as part of a deal. He didn't get jail time, but he was handed a conditional discharge, 80 hours of community service, a year of probation, and he wasn't allowed to play in any game where Steve Moore was in the lineup. If he completed the probation without issues, it would be wiped from his record. But Moore and everyone on his side weren't too satisfied, and that's where the lawsuits came in. In early 2005, Moore filed a civil suit in Colorado, not just against Bertuzzi, but also against the Canucks organization, GM Brian Burke, head coach Mark Crawford, teammate Brad May for the bounty comment he made, and even the company that owned the Canucks. The Colorado court tossed it, saying the case should be heard in Canada since that's where it happened, and Moore's team planned to appeal it, but by then, Moore was still dealing with major symptoms and injuries and hadn't returned to play hockey. So instead of appealing it, they just filed a new lawsuit, and that happened in 2006 when Moore filed a massive lawsuit in Ontario. He asked for $15 million in lost income, $1 million in aggravated damages, and $2 million in punitive damages. On top of that, his parents also sued for another $1.5 million, saying they suffered emotional trauma from watching the hit live on TV. By 2007, Moore amended the lawsuit again, and this time he was asking for $38.5 million in damages. That included $35 million for lost earnings and another $3.5 million for his parents' emotional suffering. 5 years then passed, and they still hadn't gone to court because they were still trying to figure out the full extent of Moore's injuries. At that point, Moore still had constant headaches and wasn't working at all. And after a bunch of delays, the trial was finally set for September of 2014, 10 years after the initial incident. But just before it started, Moore changed the lawsuit again, this time asking for $68 million in damages, up from the $38 million he had originally claimed. But just a few weeks before the trial was set to start, both sides reached a private settlement in which the details were never released publicly. And that was that. The case was finally put to rest. It dragged on for nearly a decade, but it was over. And during that time, Steve Moore never played another NHL game again. But for Todd Bertuzzi, his story didn't end there. After the incident, Bertuzzi was suspended for the rest of the season, including the playoffs. And when the 2005 lockout hit, many players went overseas to play in Europe, but Bertuzzi, he couldn't. He was suspended by the IIHF as well, which blocked him from playing internationally anywhere. In total, Bertuzzi ended up sitting out over 17 months from professional hockey, and when he finally returned to the NHL, his entire reputation had changed. Before the incident, Bertuzzi was one of the most feared and effective power forwards in the entire game. He was a force on that West Coast Express line that I mentioned, and he put up 46 goals and 97 points in the 02-03 season, finishing in the top 5 for Hart Trophy voting. But after the suspension, that version of Bertuzzi never really came back. In 05, he was still with the Canucks, but the magic was gone. A year later, he was traded to the Florida Panthers in the Roberto Luongo deal. He barely played there due to injuries and was shipped off to Detroit at the deadline. Over the next few seasons, Bertuzzi was bounced around the league. He had a stint with Anaheim, then to Calgary, and then finally he went back to Detroit. He put up decent numbers here and there, but he was no longer the star that he once was. Still, he played over 1,100 games in the NHL and stuck around up until 2014. But the hit on Steve Moore followed him everywhere. He was booed everywhere he went, defined by one moment, no matter what else he did. Even when he played well, there was always an asterisk next to his name. Todd Bertuzzi was once known as a dominant force, a guy you didn't want to play against. But after March 8th, 2004, no matter how many games he played or how many goals he scored, he was never just a hockey player ever again.